As we did with the European campaign, I want to cover the same type of material now in the Pacific. They are almost, during World War II, two separate campaigns. It was almost like two different wars going on, but they're tied together because the powers that are fighting in there are the governments having to worry about both campaigns, and a constant battle between the two fronts of supply priorities. How many men go to the Pacific versus what do we need in Europe? Political battles that were well beyond the scope of this course, but understand that from the military standpoint, it's almost like we're fighting the Pacific, you're fighting the Atlantic. So let's take a look at what went down in the Pacific during World War II. Again, I'm going to use a map. Please ignore all the various labels and lines and whatnot. I'll point out the significant factors as I talk about it. But the lead up to the war, and in fact, I ought to digress 1 second and talk about that. When does World War II begin? Another thought is the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And in fact, you can go back to, well, which one? When? There were several tete-a-tetes with the Russians, with the Chinese during this period. But I'm going to start here with basically by 1940-41, the map you see there shows the red part that China has ceded to, unwillingly, to the Japanese. They have moved in 1940 because of the collapse of France. Remember, France had colonies in what becomes Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. All of that was French controlled. The French government has kind of ceased to exist, doesn't have a lot of time to worry about its holdings in Southeast Asia. And the Japanese move in. What that gives them is access to the Malay Peninsula, Burma, expansion room. The Japanese didn't have Lebensraum, but they had the same need that Hitler perceived in Europe, a need to expand, to get raw materials. Understand, if you pick up nothing else, that Japan was far from an independent country. It didn't even have the land capability to grow all of its own food. It needed materials from Southeast Asia, from the United States, from other places. The Greater East Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere becomes kind of the watchword of, well, Lebensraum for the Japanese Empire. One of the things that becomes most notorious early on in the Japanese expansion is what becomes known as the Rape of Nanking. Nanking at the time was the capital of Republican China. The Japanese occupy it and has well been documented, especially in the years since World War II. Almost undescribable atrocities occurred when they took over this capital. I would put pictures up, but there are plenty of books that discuss the Rape of Nanking. Suffice it to say that something between, again, hard to estimate, but between 250,000 and 500,000 Chinese, predominantly civilians, were executed, raped, tortured, you name it, graphic stuff that is almost unimaginable. This happens to be a part of the city that was burned out by the Japanese. It's one area where some missionaries took refugees and tried to protect them from the marauding Japanese forces. But the real effort in the Pacific, taking away China and the millions of civilians that died there, begins, of course, 7th December of 1941. All of those little red areas right there are either operations on the 7th, the 8th, and it depends, of course, on the date line, or very early in the December, January 1942 time period. We're looking at attacks on the Netherlands East Indies because why? Rich, very, very rich in oil. A Royal Dutch Shell is down there with huge refineries. New Guinea. That's the opening to get into Australia and control that area of the Pacific in the southwest. Wake Island, Guam, and the Marianas were American territories. The Philippines, with American forces in the Philippines, they could block naval maneuvers moving down into the Southeast Asia area where the resources are. The Philippines had to fall and become under Japanese control. So by early 42, the Americans and the Filipinos had put up a pretty valiant fight, particularly on the Bataan Peninsula to the west of Manila, and on Corregidor Island, which basically was the big fortress guarding Manila Bay. But finally, just overcome by, well, it was almost getting to the point of starvation, disease, no supplies coming in because much as these people thought, hey, the U.S. has forgotten us and left us hanging out here, I'm sorry, we didn't have enough resources left in the United States to mount an offensive that would take those supplies to the Philippines. They were going to fall. There was nothing we could really do about it. The same in the Dutch East Indies. Holland, the government was operating in exile in the UK. They had some forces still in the Dutch East Indies, combined with Australians, Americans, British. They put up the best fight they could. It really wasn't much of a showing, and the Dutch East Indies eventually fell. Huge resource base for the Japanese Empire. This photo is one of the first of the grabbers, if you will, of the popular attention of atrocities committed by Japanese forces. When the Bataan Peninsula fell, and we surrendered the American and primarily Filipino forces that were there under General MacArthur's command, General MacArthur having been ordered out of the islands to go to Australia to mount the counteroffensive. These Americans and the Filipinos mixed in with them. The Japanese had, wow, we've never seen a mass surrender like this. How do we take care of all these people? Well, they set up some makeshift camps, and because surrender was not exactly part of the Japanese creed, they did not recognize these as being heroic warriors, but rather wimps who had surrendered, who would dishonor themselves and were treated that way. They were marched many, many miles. Those that couldn't keep up were bayoneted, otherwise dispatched. In the end, probably a few hundred Americans and many thousands of Filipinos were executed on this tremendous thing that became known as the Bataan Death March. The deprivations that occurred in the camps after they were arrived and parceled out, and many eventually sent to Japan, have been enumerated in a number of books. Again, pretty gruesome type stuff, but the word of this has gotten back to the Americans. Not only were we attacked unannounced in Pearl Harbor with the loss of several thousand Americans, but they have committed these kinds of atrocities, and on top of Nanking and other bad things that were due to happen, this becomes part and parcel of the decision process of 1945.